Hi everyone, welcome back to our Memory Lane Stories for Seniors. We are going to pick up from where we left off last week with our short story by Thomas Hardy. The name of the story is called The Withered Arm. So we will finish reading that and then we are going to read some Robert Frost poetry because it's still Poetry Month. So feel free to say hi as you sign on. If you want to share your thoughts about the short story, about Thomas Hardy, about some of your favorite memories. If you have read any Thomas Hardy works, feel free to share those with us as we go. So without further ado, we will continue. By the next afternoon, Rhoda would have done anything to escape this inquiry. But she had promised to go. Moreover, there was a horrid fascination at times in becoming instrumental in throwing such possible light on her own character as would reveal her to be something greater in the occult world than she had ever herself suspected. She started just before the time of day mentioned between them, and half an hour's brisk walking brought her to the southeastern extension of the Egdon tract of country, where the fir plantation was. A slight figure, cloaked and veiled, was already there. Rhoda recognized almost with a shudder, that Mrs. Lodge bore her left arm in a sling. They hardly spoke to each other and immediately set out on their climb into the interior of this solemn country, which stood high above the rich alluvial soil they had left an hour before. It was a long walk. Thick clouds made the atmosphere dark, though it was as yet only early afternoon, and the wind howled dismally over the slopes of the heath. Not improbably the same heath which had witnessed the agony of the Wessex king Ina, presented to after ages as Lear. Gertrude Lodge talked most, Rhoda replying with monosyllabic preoccupation. She had a strange dislike to walking on the side of her companion, where hung the afflicted arm, moving round to the other when inadvertently near it. Much heather had been brushed by their feet when they descended upon a cart track, beside which stood the house of the man they sought. He did not profess his remedial practices openly, or care anything about their continuance, his direct interests being those of a dealer in furs, turf, sharp sand, and other local products. Indeed, he affected not to believe largely in his own powers, and when warts that had been shown him for cure miraculously disappeared, which it must be owned they infallibly did, he would say lightly, "Oh, I only drink a glass of grog upon 'em at your expense. Perhaps it's all chance," and immediately turn the subject. He was at home when they arrived, having in fact seen them descending into his valley. He was a gray-bearded man with a reddish face, and he looked singularly at Rhoda the first moment he beheld her. Mrs. Lodge told him her errand, and then with words of self-disparagement he examined her arm. "Medicine can't cure it," he said promptly. "'Tis the work of an enemy." Rhoda shrank into herself and drew back. "An enemy? What enemy?" asked Mrs. Lodge. He shook his head. "That's best known to yourself," he said. "If you like, I can show the person to you, though I shall not myself know who it is. I can do no more, and don't wish to do that." She pressed him, on which he told Rhoda to wait outside where she stood, and took Mrs. Lodge into the room. It opened immediately from the door, and, as the latter remained ajar, Rhoda Brooke could see the proceedings without taking any part in them. He brought a tumbler from the dresser, nearly filled it with water, and fetching an egg, prepared it in some private way, after which he broke it on the edge of the glass, so that the white went in and the yolk remained. As it was getting gloomy, he took the glass and its contents to the window and told Gertrude to watch the mixture closely. They leaned over the table together, and the milkwoman could see the opaline hue of the egg fluid changing form as it sank in the water, but she was not near enough to define the shape that it assumed. "Do you catch the likeness of any face or figure as you look?" demanded the conjurer of the young woman. She murmured a reply in tones so low as to be inaudible to Rhoda, and continued to gaze intently into the glass. Rhoda turned and walked a few steps away. When Mrs. Lodge came out, and her face was met by the light, it appeared exceedingly pale as Rhoda's, against the sad dun shades of the upland's garniture. Trendle shut the door behind her, and at once started homeward together. But Rhoda perceived that her companion had quite changed. "Did he charge much?" she asked tentatively. "Oh, no, nothing. He would not take a farthing," said Gertrude. "And what did you see?" inquired Rhoda. "Nothing I care to speak of." The constraint in her manner was remarkable. Her face was so rigid as to wear an oldened aspect, faintly suggestive of the face in Rhoda's bedchamber. "Was it you who first proposed coming here?" Mrs. Lodge suddenly inquired after a long pause. "How very odd, if you did." "No, but I am not sorry we have come, all things considered," she replied. For the first time, a sense of triumph possessed her, and she did not altogether deplore that the young thing at her side should learn that their lives had been antagonized by other influences than their own. The subject was no more alluded to during the long and dreary walk home, but in some way or other, a story was whispered about the many-dairied lowland that winter, that Mrs. Lodge's gradual loss of the use of her left arm was owing to her being overlooked by Rhoda Brooke. The latter kept her own counsel about the incubus, but her face grew sadder and thinner, and in the spring she and her boy disappeared from the neighborhood of Holmstoke. Half a dozen years passed away, and Mr. and Mrs. Lodge's married experience sank into prosiness and worse. The farmer was usually gloomy and silent. The woman whom he had wooed for her grace and beauty was contorted and disfigured in the limb. Moreover, she had brought him no child, which rendered it likely that he would be the last of a family who had occupied that valley for some 200 years. He thought of Rhoda Brooke and her son, and feared this might be a judgment from heaven upon him. The once blithe-hearted and enlightened Gertrude was changing into an irritable, superstitious woman, whose whole time was given to experimenting upon her ailment with every quack remedy she came across. She was honestly attached to her husband, and was ever secretly hoping against hope to win back his heart again by regaining some, at least, of her personal beauty. Hence it arose that her closet was lined with bottles, packets, and ointment pots of every description, nay, bunches of mystic herbs, charms, and books of necromancy, which in her school time she would have ridiculed as folly. "Damned if you won't poison yourself with these apothecary messes and witch mixtures some time or other," said her husband, when his eyes chanced to fall upon the multitudinous array. She did not reply, but turned her sad, soft glance upon him in such heart-swollen reproach that he looked sorry for his words and added, "I only meant it for your good, you know, Gertrude." "I'll clear out the whole lot and destroy them," she said huskily, "and try such remedies no more." "You want somebody to cheer you," he observed. "I once thought of adopting a boy, but he is too old now, and he has gone away, and I don't know where." She guessed to whom he alluded, for Rhoda Brooke's story had in the course of years become known to her. though not a word had ever passed between her husband and herself on the subject. Neither had she ever spoken to him of her visit to Conjurer Trendle, and of what was revealed to her, or she thought was revealed to her, by that solitary heathman. She was now 25, but she seemed older. 6 years of marriage and only a few months of love, she sometimes whispered to herself. And then she thought of the apparent cause, and said with a tragic glance at her withering limb, "If I could only again be as I was when he first saw me." She obediently destroyed her nostrums and charms, but there remained a hankering wish to try something else, some other sort of cure altogether. She had never revisited Trendle since she had been conducted to the house of the solitary by Rhoda against her will. But it now suddenly occurred to Gertrude that she would, in a last desperate effort at deliverance from the seeming curse, again seek out the man, if yet he lived. He was entitled to a certain credence, for the indistinct form he had raised in the glass had undoubtedly resembled the only woman in the world who, as she now knew, though not then, could have a reason for bearing her ill will. The visit should be paid. This time she went alone, though she nearly got lost on the heath, and roamed a considerable distance out of her way. Trendle's house was reached at last. However, he was not indoors, and instead of waiting at the cottage, she went to where his bent figure was pointed out to her at work a long way off. Trendle remembered her, and laying down the handful of furze roots which he was gathering and throwing into a heap, he offered to accompany her in her homeward direction, as the distance was considerable and the days were now short. So they walked together, his head bowed nearly to the earth, and his form of a color with it. "You can send away warts and other excrescences, I know," she said. "Why can't you send away this?" And the arm was uncovered. "You think too much of my powers," said Trendle, "and I am old and weak now, too. No, no, it is too much for me to attempt in my own person. What have you tried?" She named to him some of the 100 medicaments and counter spells which she had adopted from time to time. He shook his head. "Some were good enough," he said approvingly, "but not many of them for such as this. This is of the nature of a blight, not of the nature of a wound, and if you ever do throw it off, it will be all at once. If I only could! There is only one chance of doing it known to me. It has never failed in kindred afflictions, that I can declare. But it is hard to carry out, and especially for a woman." "Tell me," she said. "You must touch with the limb the neck of a man who's been hanged." She startled a little at the image he had raised. "Before he's cold, just after he's cut down," continued the conjurer impassively. "How can that do good?" "It will turn the blood and change the constitution. But as I say, to do it is hard. You must go to the jail when there's a hanging, and wait for him when he is brought off the gallows. Lots have done it, though perhaps not such pretty women as you. I used to send dozens for skin complaints, but that was in former times. The last I sent was in 13, nearly 12 years ago." He had no more to tell her, and when he had put her into a straight track homeward, turned and left her, refusing all money, as at first. The communication sank deep into Gertrude's mind. Her nature was rather a timid one, and probably all of her remedies that the White Wizard could have suggested there was not one which would have filled her with so much aversion as this, not to speak of the immense obstacles in the way of its adoption. Casterbridge, the county town, was 12 or 15 miles off, and though in those days, when men were executed for horse stealing, it was not likely that she could get access to the body of the criminal unaided. and the fear of her husband's anger made her reluctant to breathe a word of Trendle's suggestion to him or to anybody about him. She did nothing for months and patiently bore her disfigurement as before. But her woman's nature, craving for renewed love through the medium of renewed beauty, she was but 25, was ever stimulating her to try what, at any rate, could hardly do her any harm. What came by a spell will go by a spell, surely, she would say. Whenever her imagination pictured the act, she shrank in terror from the possibility of it. Then the words of the conjurer, "It will turn your blood," were seen to be capable of a scientific no less than a ghastly interpretation. The mastering desire returned and urged her on again. There was at this time but one county paper, and that her husband only occasionally borrowed. But old-fashioned days had old-fashioned means, and news was extensively conveyed by word of mouth from market to market, or from fair to fair, so that whenever such an event as an execution was about to take place, few within a radius of 20 miles were ignorant of the coming sight. And so far as Holmstoke was concerned, some enthusiasts had been known to walk all the way to Casterbridge and back in one day, solely to witness the spectacle. The next assizes were in March, and when Gertrude Lodge heard that they had been held, she inquired stealthily at the inn as to the result, as soon as she could find the opportunity. She was, however, too late. The time at which the sentences were to be carried out had arrived, and to make the journey and obtain admission at such short notice required at least her husband's assistance. She dared not tell him, for she had found by delicate experiments that these smoldering village beliefs made him furious if mentioned, partly because he half entertained them himself. It was therefore necessary to wait for another opportunity. Her determination received a fillip from learning that 2 epileptic children had attended from this very village of Holmstoke many years before, with beneficial results. Oh, thank you. Though the experiment had been strongly condemned by the neighboring clergy. April, May, June passed, and it is no overstatement to say that by the end of the last named month, Gertrude well nigh longed for the death of a fellow creature. Instead of her formal prayers each night, her unconscious prayer was, "O Lord, hang some guilty or innocent person soon." This time she made earlier inquiries and was altogether more systematic in her proceedings. Moreover, the season was summer, between the haymaking and the harvest, and in the leisure thus afforded him, her husband had been holiday-taking away from home. The assizes were in July, and she went to the inn as before. There was to be one execution, only one, for arson. Her greatest problem was not how to get to Casterbridge, but what means she should adopt for obtaining admission to the jail. Though access for such purposes had formerly never been denied, the custom had fallen into desuetude. And in contemplating her possible difficulties, she was again almost driven to fall back upon her husband. But on sounding him about the assizes, he was so uncommunicative, so more than usually cold, that she did not proceed, and decided that whatever she did, she would do alone. Fortune, obdurate hitherto, showed her unexpected favor. On the Thursday before the Saturday fixed for the execution, Lodge remarked to her that he was going away from home for another day or two on business at a fair, and that he was sorry he could not take her with him. She exhibited on this occasion so much readiness to stay at home that he looked at her in surprise. Time had been when she would have shown deep disappointment at the loss of such a jaunt. However, he lapsed into his usual taciturnity, and on the day named left Holmstoke. It was now her turn. She at first had thought of driving, but on reflection held that driving would not do. since it would necessitate her keeping to the turnpike road, and so increase by tenfold the risk of her ghastly errand being found out. She decided to ride and avoid the beaten track, notwithstanding that in her husband's stables there was no animal just at present which by any stretch of imagination could be considered a lady's mount, in spite of his promise before marriage to always keep a mare for her. He had, however, many cart horses, fine ones of their kind, and among the rest was a serviceable creature, an equine Amazon, with a back as broad as a sofa, on which Gertrude had occasionally taken an airing when unwell. This horse she chose. On Friday afternoon, one of the men brought it round. She was dressed, and before going down, looked at her shriveled arm. "Ah," she said to it, "if it had not been for you, this terrible ordeal would have been saved me." When strapping up the bundle in which she carried a few articles of clothing, she took occasion to say to the servant, "I take these in case I should not get back tonight from the person I am going to visit. Don't be alarmed if I am not in by 10, and close up the house as usual. I shall be at home tomorrow for certain." She meant then to tell her husband privately. The deed accomplished was not like the deed projected. He would almost certainly forgive her. And then the pretty, palpitating Gertrude Lodge went from her husband's homestead, but though her goal was Casterbridge, she did not take the direct route thither through Stickleford. Her cunning course at first was in precisely the opposite direction. As soon as she was out of sight, however, she turned to the left by a road which led to Egdon, and on entering the heath, wheeled around and set out in the true course, due westerly. A more private way down the country could not be imagined, and as to direction, she had merely to keep her horse's head to a point little to the right of the sun. She knew that she would light upon a furze cutter or a cottager of some sort from time to time, from whom she might correct her bearing. Though the date was comparatively recent, Egdon was much less fragmentary in character than now. The attempts, successful and otherwise, at cultivation on the lower slopes, which intrude and break up the original heath into small, detached heaths, had not been carried far. Enclosure acts had not taken effect, and the banks and fences which now exclude the cattle of those villagers, who formerly enjoyed the rights of commonage thereon, and the carts of those who had turbary privileges which kept them in firing all the year round, were not erected. Gertrude, therefore, rode along with no other obstacles than the prickly furze bushes, the mats of heather, the white water courses, and the natural steeps and declivities of the ground. Her horse was sure, if heavy-footed and slow, and though a draught animal, was easy-paced. Had it been otherwise, she was not a woman who could have ventured to ride over such a bit of country with a half-dead arm. It was therefore nearly 8 o'clock when she drew rein to breathe her bearer on the last outlighting high point of heathland towards Casterbridge, previous to leaving Egdon for the cultivated valleys. She halted before a pool called Rushy Pond, flanked by the ends of 2 hedges. A railing ran through the center of the pond, dividing it in half. Over the railing she saw the low green country, over the green trees the roofs of the town, over the roofs a white flat facade denoting the entrance to the county jail. On the roof of this front specks were moving about. They seemed to be workmen erecting something. Her flesh crept. She descended slowly and was soon amid cornfields and pastures. In another half hour, when it was almost dark, Gertrude reached the White Hart, the first inn of the town on that side. Little surprise was excited by her arrival. Farmers' wives rode on horseback, then more than they do now, though, for that matter, Mrs. Lodge was not imagined to be a wife at all. The innkeeper supposed her some harum-scarum young woman who had come to attend hang fair the next day. Neither her husband nor herself had ever dealt in Casterbridge market, so that she was unknown. While dismounting, she beheld a crowd of boys standing at the door of a harness maker's shop just above the inn, looking inside it with deep interest. "What is going on there?" she asked of the ostler. "Making the rope for tomorrow." She throbbed responsively and contracted her arm. "'Tis sold by the inch afterwards," the man continued. "I could get you a bit, miss, for nothing, if you would like." She hastily repudiated any such wish, all the more from a curious creeping feeling that the condemned wretch's destiny was becoming interwoven with her own, and having engaged a room for the night, sat down to think. Up to this time, she had formed but the vaguest notions about her means of obtaining access to the prison. The words of the cunning man returned to her mind. He had implied that she should use her beauty, impaired though it was, as a passkey. In her experience, she knew little about jail functionaries. She had heard of a high sheriff and an under-sheriff, but dimly only. She knew, however, that there must be a hangman, and to the hangman she determined to apply. At this date, and for several years after, there was a hangman to almost every jail. Gertrude found, on inquiry, that the Casterbridge official dwelt in a lonely cottage by a deep, slow river flowing under the cliff on which the prison buildings were situate. The stream being the self-same one, though she did not know it, which watered the Stickleford and Holmstoke meads lower down in its course. Having changed her dress, and before she had eaten or drunk, for she could not take her ease till she had ascertained some particulars, Gertrude pursued her way by a path along the waterside to the cottage indicated. Passing thus on the outskirts of the jail, she discerned on the level roof over the gateway 3 rectangular lines against the sky, where the specks had been moving in her distant view. She recognized what the erection was, and passed on quickly. Another 100 years brought her to the Another 100 yards brought her to the executioner's house, which a boy pointed out. It stood close to the same stream, and was hard by a weir, the waters of which emitted a steady roar. While she stood hesitating, the door opened, and an old man came forth, shading a candle with one hand. Locking the door on the outside, he turned to a flight of wooden steps fixed against the end of the cottage, and began to ascend them, this being evidently the staircase to his bedroom. Gertrude hastened forward, but by the time she reached the foot of the ladder, he was at the top. She called to him loudly enough to be heard above the roar of the weir. He looked down and said, "What do you want here?" "To speak to you a minute." The candlelight, such as it was, fell upon her imploring, pale, upturned face, and Davies, as the hangman was called, backed down the ladder. "I was just going to bed," he said. "Early to bed and early to rise. But I don't mind stopping a minute for such a one as you. Come into house." He reopened the door and preceded her to the room within. The implements of his daily work, which was that of a jobbing gardener, stood in a corner, and seeing probably that she looked rural, he said, "If you want me to undertake country work, I can't come, for I never leave Casterbridge for gentler nor simpler. Not I. My real calling is officer of justice," he added formally. Yes, that's it. Tomorrow." "Ah, I thought so. Well, what's the matter about that? 'Tis no use to come here about the knot. Folks do come continually. But I tell 'em one knot is as merciful as another, if you keep it under the ear. Is the unfortunate man a relation? Or I should say, perhaps," looking at her dress, "a person who's been in your employ?" "No. What time is the execution?" The same as usual, 12 o'clock, or as soon after as the London mail coach gets in. We always wait for that, in case of a reprieve. Oh, a reprieve. I hope not, she said involuntarily. Well, hee. As a matter of business, so do I. But still, if ever a young fellow deserved to be let off, this one does. Only just turned 18, and only present by chance when the rick was fired. Howsomever, there's not much risk of it, as they are obliged to make an example of him, there having been so much destruction of property that way lately. I mean, she explained, that I want to touch him for a charm, a cure of an affliction, by the advice of a man who has proved the virtue of the remedy. Oh, yes, miss, now I understand. I've had such people come in past years, but it didn't strike me that you looked of a sort to require blood turning. What's the complaint? The wrong kind for this, I'll be bound. My arm, she reluctantly showed him the withered skin. Ah, 'tis all a scram, said the hangman, examining it. Yes, said she. Well, he continued with interest, that is the class of subject, I'm bound to admit. I like the look of the wound. It is truly as suitable for the cure as any I ever saw. 'Twas a knowing man that sent ye, whoever he was. You can contrive for me all that's necessary, she said breathlessly. You should really have gone to the governor of the jail, and that's your doctor with thee, and given your name and address. That's how it used to be done, if I recollect. Still, perhaps, I can manage it for a trifling fee. Oh, thank you. I would rather do it this way, as I should like it kept private. Lover not to know, eh? No, husband. Aha, very well. I'll get ye a touch of the corpse. Where is it now? She said, shuddering. It? He, you mean? He's livin' yet. Just inside that little small winder up there in the glum. He signified the jail on the cliff above. She thought of her husband and her friends. Yes, of course, she said. How am I to proceed? He took her to the door. Now, do you be waiting at the little wicket in the wall that you'll find up there in the lane, not latter than 1 o'clock. I will open it from the inside, and I shan't come home to dinner till he's cut down. Good night. Be punctual, and if you don't want anybody to know, wear a veil. Ah, once I had such a daughter as you. She went away and climbed to the path above, to assure herself that she would be able to find the wicket the next day. Its outline was soon visible to her, a narrow opening in the outer wall of the prison precincts. The steep was so great that, having reached the wicket, she stopped for a moment to breathe, and looking back upon the waterside cot, saw the hangman again ascending his outdoor staircase. He entered the loft or chamber to which it led, and in a few minutes extinguished his light. The town clock struck 10, and she returned to White Hart as she had come. Well, I think we'll finish there for today. We just have a few pages left to finish this story, but I think we'll finish them next week. Thank you for joining us for our memory lane today. I hope you enjoyed that short story, and we'll finish it next week. So feel free to tune back in then. You can also watch today's reading on our YouTube channel. So you can always check us out at the Sylvan Lake Municipal Library or Sylvan Lake Library on YouTube. I hope you guys have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoy celebrating the rest of Poetry Month. We didn't get to read any Robert Frost poetry today, but we'll aim for that next time. Have a great day. We'll see you next time. Bye.